Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Jewell with the Career Technical Education Foundation. I'm here with Scott Whitey, who is a lead scientist and lab manager at Labcon, located in Petaluma, California. Scott, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Hi there.
So we're going to just start off by having you tell us what it is you do at Labcon on a daily basis as the lead scientist and lab manager.
Sure. So Labcon makes essentially biotech devices. So if you are doing research, if you are working in a medical field, a lot of what you do involves single-use plastic. And so there are reasons for that, like you want to avoid contamination of experiments. You want to be able to make sure that your experiments are repeatable. You don't want to necessarily reuse things. What we do is we make the little pieces of plastic that are actually used to contact experiments. So I don't know how familiar your students are with biotech, but biotech is a lot like making recipes. So like when you look in a cookbook, you get a recipe and it says, put in a cup of flour and put in a tablespoon of salt and put in a teaspoon of vinegar or something like that. And biotech actually works the same way. And so you basically get a recipe where you want that recipe, rather than making a cake, you want that recipe to actually make things like DNA copy itself. And so the way you actually do that is you set up little plastic devices called pipette tips. And those pipette tips allow you to measure out different amounts of different chemicals and different molecules. And you actually have to combine them in the proportions dictated by the recipe. And just like in a cake, if you put in the wrong proportions of ingredients, the cake won't really be a cake. It'll taste strange, it won't rise, it'll do all the things, it won't do the things cakes need to do. And molecular reactions are exactly the same thing. You can put in the right ingredients, but if you put them in the wrong proportions, the actual molecular reaction doesn't happen. The DNA doesn't copy itself. The cells don't live. And so what Labcon actually does is we make little plastic devices that do these measurements, right? And so you can actually take out a teaspoon of salt or a tablespoon of sugar, but actually as molecules, the things you need to combine in the right proportions. So for my job, part of my job, honestly, is QC. So I make sure that what we make actually works. So we make between 4 and 5 million of these little pieces a day, and they all have to have exactly the right geometry. So part of that is QC. We also want to make sure that our things are not
For those who don't know what QC is, quality control.
Quality control. So anytime you make in any factory, a factory for food or a factory for biotech or a factory for cars, you have to make sure that what you're making is correct, right? And when you're trying to do something, in our case, 5 million times every single day, you have to make sure that each of those things lives up to its specifications. And so part of what we want to do is make sure that each of those things has the correct geometry. The other thing that I do specifically for the lab, because we are dealing with biotech experiments, we're dealing with cells, we're dealing with DNA, we're dealing with bacteria, we want to be sure that the things that we sell into labs are not contaminated with those things, right? So we actually check to be sure there's no DNA contamination. We make sure there's no endotoxin contamination. Endotoxin is something that's made by bacteria like E. coli. So we do a lot of QC to be sure that our machines remain clean and the parts we make remain clean as well, so that they don't disrupt experiments in the end. So that's part of what I do. One of the things that's really great about science and great about my job is I actually get to work on new things. And so not only is it just QC of things that we already make, we also try to develop new things that make science easier or make science better. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is to look at biotech in a different way. Think about biotech in terms of what small piece of plastic, what large piece of plastic, what device could actually improve the throughput or how quickly or how well an experiment can be done. And I think that's really one of the benefits of being in science. Your job can be very different day to day, because you might have QC to do one day, but you might have product development to do another day. And so that's basically what I do. I also talk to customers a lot. We get a lot of customer questions about what's the right device for my experiment. And I have to often talk them through, here's why we think this is the right piece or the right fit, or why what you're doing is not the right fit for this particular piece, and try to understand their experiment. And that's a really good way to stay in touch with sort of the modern scientific community, that you get to see like what kinds of experiments are being done with the things you make and making sure that they're going to fit into their workflow. And it's a way to really understand how science is happening right now.
So you already touched on some of the things that you like about that job. What are some of the things that what are other things you like about that job, as well as what are some of the things that you really like about Labcon in general?
science especially is in this really cool era where things change really rapidly. The example I often use when thinking about science is, I got my graduate degree 15 years ago now, a long time ago. And I would do an experiment. It was actually a pretty groundbreaking experiment back then where I would use 300 data points all at once to get a result. And now there are experiments that use 3 million data points all at once to get a result. And like in, a decade and a half, these science experiments, especially now, have gone into these massive things. And so you get to see that develop. And I think that's what's really cool about being in science, is you get to see things change over time. And honestly, we're working on important things. I mean, it's like we're recording this right now during this COVID disaster. And a lot of what's going to be the response to that is going to be correctly based on science. That science is going to say, we're going to make a vaccine, or we're going to do treatments, or we're going to invent devices to save lives. Even if it's not something as dramatic as COVID, we are often working on things that are really important in the end, in terms of people's health, in terms of people's livelihoods. We are actually doing things that have really important outcomes for people. One of the reasons I like working at Labcon, I will say we treat people really well. Our employees generally are pretty happy with working there. We also are doing manufacturing in America. A lot of manufacturing has moved overseas, to be blunt. And so we are actually still doing it here in California. And that's hard. I mean, there are upsides to doing certain work overseas in terms of cost and things like that. One of the ways we are really successful in California is we make really good things. So I mentioned we make pipette tips. We make millions of these pipette tips a day. We also make centrifuge tubes, and our centrifuge tubes are, I will say, the best in the world. Like, they are these high quality things that when you're doing centrifugation, this thing put some liquid in a device called a centrifuge. It spins around, and you can purify different chemicals from that centrifuge. We make the best in the world, right? And so, but a lot of that, those things. Sorry, go ahead.
So I said, which gives you a pride for
yeah, absolutely. And I think I think it's really good to work on something you really care about and something that is quality. And I will say, like, not just Labcon, but science in general, I think there's a certain pride that comes with being a scientist, because A, you're working on something important, but B, you're working on something that can be groundbreaking and you have ownership of. Because if you work in an academic lab, or you work for Pfizer, or you work for Genentech, you have your little domain where you're working on something that's yours. And you might be the first one to discover a thing that no one else knows about. You might be the first one to invent a thing that no one has invented before. We've done that at Labcon a couple times. And so I think that's one of the reasons I like working at Labcon. We treat people well. We are in science. There's also a certain amount of autonomy within science, and especially at Labcon, that you get to sort of figure out your pathway forward. And every day is different. Like I said, it's product design, it's product QC, it's a lot of customer interaction, it's a lot of talking to scientists about what they need from us. So if you like variety, I would absolutely advocate for people getting into science.
Now, you had mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic happening right now. Are you guys at Labcon having to alter anything about how you do business to adjust to the needs of the medical device industry right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's interesting. There are definitely certain parts, certain devices that we make which are much more in demand than when they were before. I mean, the way the manufacturing at our facility works is we have metal molds. They make these pieces of, you take plastic, you melt it, you inject it to this mold. These little pieces of plastic get formed into a shape, and then they come out, and then that's the part. That's the thing that does the thing. Certain parts have a huge demand right now, a demand that's actually hard to keep up with, because that's sort of part of the process of researching COVID, and those specific parts are really, so we definitely had to shift some of our resources to, we are making these parts even more than we did before. One of the ways that really we've proven ourselves is, again, we make really good things. And I think rather than customers worrying about, well, am I getting something that's going to work every time? Do I know if I buy 4 million of this that it's going to arrive and I'm not going to be able to use all of it? Labcon has really QC'd and designed biotech parts to work in actual experiments, in actual labs. I will say that's, I guess, one of the other parts I like about my job. a lot of manufacturing doesn't necessarily have a lab on site. I'm sort of strangely unique at my company in the sense that most manufacturing in plastics does not necessarily have a biotech person or a biotech lab. And so that's sort of where I fit in, that we actually have a lab on site to use the products that we manufacture at Labcon to be sure that they're actually going to work when they get to labs out in the world. So I think that's one of the really valuable things about having a lab actually at Labcon.
Mm-hmm. Now, will you give us a brief snapshot about kind of, I guess, why you chose this career, but also
Sure.
how you got into this career?
One of the things I did is after my sophomore year, I had taken this course. I really liked science. I went and I did an internship the summer after my sophomore year, and I actually worked in a lab. And that is really, I think, the biggest piece of advice I could give. Science in textbooks is really interesting. If you read it and like it, that's a really good start. Like you should like reading about science and you should enjoy reading about science. But science in textbooks is in the textbook because it works, right? Like it's the reason it's a chapter in your biochemistry book or it's a chapter in your bio 101 book is because that experiment worked. And so real science doesn't work that way at all, like not even close. Like you're going to do experiments 50 times and it's not going to work 50 times. And you're going to have to figure out, why did this not work? And some people have a personality for that and some people don't have a personality for that. That's fine. But the thing I would really advocate for is you want to try to get actual experience in a lab or actual experience doing science outside of just coursework. So the best way to do that early is you should take a course that has a lab component. And so I know a lot of the intro bio classes have a lab. Those labs are fine. Those labs are actually good to gain skills like how do you pipette? How do you fill up test tubes? How do you think about science generally? But Bio 101 classes, Bio 1 classes, intro classes tend to have pretty simple experiments that we know are going to work. And that's good. We want to have some success when you start. But as you get farther down into the science curriculum, the lab components get harder, right? And you have to think a little bit more about like, well, I'm setting up my own experiment. How am I going to get this experiment to work? Some people hate that, to be perfectly honest. Some people will get to their junior year in college or their senior year in college and realize that they don't really want to be lab scientists, there are lots of other science pathways you can take. You can teach, you can sales, you can do customer support. But I will say that a lot of science is initially based on, do you like doing lab work, right? And are you good at lab work? The best way to do that is get into a lab as quickly as you can, as soon as you've decided you like science, and either take a hard lab course, an advanced lab course, or try to get an internship. And internships, I will tell you, can be very repetitive when you first get them. Like you're going to be doing the thing that every other scientist started doing when they first got there. My first internship, I made DNA gels, I washed glassware, and I did a little bit of cell culture, very little. And it was boring at first, but I also found I could handle the fact that repetition was part of science. And I also liked figuring out how to make things work a little bit better. And that's something I would really advocate for. I will also say that's the coolest part of science, is that you get to tweak and improve and think about things in a more broad sense and try to expand your mind about what science can be. So again, I would advocate for take a course with a lab component, get an internship, get in a lab, decide if you have the patience and the skill necessary to be a scientist as opposed to just reading your textbook, because the textbook is going to sound like science is easy and fun and breakthroughs all the time, and that is definitely not true.
Well, Scott, we're going to wrap it up right there. Thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about your career and what it takes to be successful at it.
Great. Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks.